As advanced therapies revolutionize patient care, their success increasingly depends on more than scientific innovation. Behind each personalized dose lies a complex ecosystem of collection sites, couriers, cryopreservation facilities, biostorage, and manufacturing centers. And when those elements operate in silos, timelines suffer while patient material is at risk. I'm Miles Skoda. This is the CellAndGene.com virtual event series, and today we're talking solving fragmentation. We've got expert insights on future-proofing the advanced therapy supply chain. Now, joining me for this presentation is a panel of industry experts, first from Cryoport Systems, SVP and Chief Commercial Officer Aruna Moore, and Vice President of Technical Operations at IntegraCell, Dominic Clark. From Carigent, co-founder and CEO Brian Newsome, and from SK pharmteco, Global Head of Cell and Gene Therapy, John Lee. A big welcome to our panelists, and thank you all for joining us for the discussion. And now just a few things before we get started. We are going to have a Q&A session at the end of this discussion, so please feel free to submit questions as we go along. We'll get to as many as possible during that Q&A, and any that we don't get to, I'm going to pass along to the panel for some potential follow-up after the event. And then just a bit of a little housekeeping. If you run into any issues today, please try refreshing your browser first. If your problem persists, you can submit a question through that Q&A, and I'll help get you back on track. And then finally, this event will be available on demand usually within a day, often much less. You can just use the same link that you used today, but you'll also get an email to it as well. So let's get the discussion started. Like I mentioned before, today's session, the title starts with solving fragmentation. So let me ask first, from your perspectives, and we'll ask this of all the panel, what does fragmentation look like in the advanced therapy supply chain today? And why is it such a critical issue for the industry to solve? And Aruna, let's start with you because you're up on my screen right now.
Absolutely, Miles. And you kind of, rightly said in the beginning, right, why it is such a challenge and why we need to make sure that we kind of break the silos and we get out of the fragmentation. But if you talk about fragmentation from in perspective from vein to vein, right, you see it from very beginning, from the collection to the cryopreservation to the logistics side, storage, manufacturing, right? I mean, these are all happening in silos. And so that's a major issue. You see it on the manufacturing side, logistics side, where chain of custody and chain of identity is a big issue, right? Making sure that the starting material is delivered to the patient. We know exactly where it's coming from, where it's going. Also, if you look at when sponsors work with multiple vendors, right? They're using different data platforms, and these are not connected. That itself causes a lot of fragmentation. And of course, still as CGT is developing, we see regional variations in the regulatory environment, right? So what works in the US may not work in the EU and the UK. And why is it very important, right? As we're thinking of commercializing CGT, as we want to make sure that these therapies get to the masses, are accessible, it's very, very important that any risk associated with it is minimized. This will also, the defragmentation would also minimize the cost associated with it, making sure that reliable therapies are accessible on time to our patients.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks, Aruna. Brian, any thoughts here?
Yeah, Aruna covered it pretty well. Maybe just add a couple of points. So I think maybe specific to cell and gene therapy, one of the issues we have is we're dealing with a lot of times live cells. And so any small bit of, issue gets exacerbated. When you're shipping a chemical, when you're shipping something that's kind of inert, you can have some fluctuations, and it doesn't create the issues that it does when you're trying to deliver cells, fresh product, especially like apheresis. So all those little handoffs, all those, like she said, silos and differences in the way things are handled all create risk. And all that risk is just exacerbated in our setting. So I think making sure that we have proper handoffs, making sure that we have transparency and visibility from what's happening from one place to the other is extra critical in our space.
That's great. Yeah. Thanks, Brian. John, anything you wanted to add in here?
Yeah, I mean, I think they've covered it pretty well to date to this point in the talk. I mean, the fragmentation, it shows up in, a series of disconnected handoffs between all the stakeholders, whether they be CDMOs or logistics providers, regulators, and ultimately this leads to delays and obviously extreme risk to the patient material, particularly on the cell therapy side. The the as I think about fragmentation, it takes me back to when I was a child and we would play these games in elementary school where you would whisper into the child next to you something, and then it would go down the line. And before you get to the end of, by the time it gets to the last person in line, it's a completely different message. And so, the problem with fragmented supply chains is that it's very much like that game. There's too many whispers, there's too little clarity, and there's too much at risk when accuracy means everything. So being able to go from that first person to that last person in the line is really the ultimate goal and where we need to go.
That's perfect, John. I love that analogy. That's great. Dominic, I'll bring you in here. I know everybody said a lot already. Anything else you wanted to add in on this one?
Yeah. I figured, knowing the group I'm working with here, that they would certainly provide the expertise and cover all the topics. So I 100% concur with everything that's been said. And John's analogy was perfect. I was thinking something similar but different. But ultimately, maybe as a recap from just hearing what they're saying and what I'm thinking as well, right? We know that the space is, truly complex, right? And so you've got your, you think end to end, you've got your collection sites, your transportation, your cryopreservation and storage, your manufacturing centers, and then subsequently back to the clinical administration sites. So every one of these is their own unique silos, right? And so it comes down to connectivity. I think we're going to hear that a lot throughout this discussion today, is how do we connect those dots and in a streamlined fashion and integrate some of those steps so that we can ultimately solve the problems, which is what we're trying to do. And I think a lot of times we talk about manufacturing, but we forget about, all these other complexities that come with cell and gene therapies. And so being able to connect those is going to be a critical key to access and maintaining, and scale, but then, in the background, maintaining that critical component of quality.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks, Dominic. And maybe I can have you kick off this next one here. So, I talked about early on, the whole ecosystem, of course, that includes couriers, collection sites, CDMOs, logistics partners, regulators. Is there one thing in the ecosystem that it still needs that you think to get right to enable true scalability?
Well, I think so. We as an industry, we keep talking about scaling advanced therapies. I think let's be honest, right? Without true interoperability, and that in concert with integrated platforms, scalability is just really going to continue to be just another buzzword in the industry, right? And so the CGT ecosystem is still pretty reliant on that siloed approach that we already talked about. It's held together by a lot of groups having proprietary processes and information and or customized processes, spreadsheets, emails, and a whole bunch of hope, right? And so we've got the supply chain, the CDMOs, hospitals, regulators, as you just stated, all operating in these fragmented systems. And somehow, we expect precision therapies to be manufactured and move flawlessly through this chaos. So I think if we're really serious about scalability, we need to stop basically pretending that the critical aspects like manual processes, proprietary platforms, and paper-based systems are good enough, right? So if we can't reduce that fragmentation and deliver a more connected, integrated network, then we're not really scaling. We're simply surviving today. And until those dots are connected, we're again limiting the access, looking at increased risk, and really slowing down the therapies that patients can't afford to wait for. So I might throw it back and say that the challenge really is: are we as an industry ready to truly turn talking about it into actually doing it?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. John, any insights here?
Yeah, I think that Don really covered the one piece very, very well, and that's that interoperability piece. But I think the next level down to that's foundational to having that interoperability is standardization of processes that really underlie what we're doing from a value chain perspective, whether it be manufacturing or some other piece of that value chain. I go back to the most simplistic of answers and really just thinking about product variability for a cell therapy. We talk a lot about patient-to-patient variability, and certainly that's a real thing. But there's a lot of product variability within the same product. If you have multiple centers of collection for cryopreservation of a starting material, we don't really see a lot of variability, or at least a much lesser degree of variability of the product, the resultant product, when it comes from a single collection site. But when we start to bring in, when sponsors start to bring in additional collection sites, that's really where we start to see more and more product variability. So it's something as simple as an apheresis and a subsequent cryopreservation, and the lack of standardization between sites that really underlies that interoperability piece. And that's just one example. And I think that there's a lot of different ways that this can take shape, whether it's I think Dominic was saying, digital platforms, really helping the various stakeholders talk to one another, but ultimately the standardization is going to be the foundation for all the other pieces that need to come into play to achieve the scale that we need in order to ultimately get these medicines into the patient population at scale.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks, John. Brian, can I maybe get you in here? You got anything that you wanted to add on this one?
I think they've covered it pretty well. I think maybe two words I would add that make, to me, this is a pretty important part. One's efficiency. So I think when you're scaling anything, you've got to make things more efficient. Right now, we're doing things in small batches, small numbers, and we can brute force almost anything, right? So when you're dealing with, doing a 15-patient clinical trial, you can brute force supply chain just like you can brute force manufacturing. But when you talk about trying to service 10,000 patients or 100,000 patients, that just doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work in manufacturing, but it doesn't work in the supply chain either. And so I think we have to get more efficient about the way that we do things. And I think one way to do that is visibility. And I think we've talked about that, digital platforms, breaking silos. We have a lot of proprietary things in the space. And I know when people want to protect their IP and people want to have things that they can differentiate from others, but it really does a discredit to the whole industry when everything is so siloed. So I think if we get better visibility in the space where there's visibility, on a supply chain, especially when you're dealing with live products, and one part doesn't know what the next part's doing, it just creates risk. So I think if we get better efficiency in the way we do things, and if we can create some visibility, so that players in the chain know what's going on, it'll help us scale.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Brian. All right. Let me switch it up a little bit here. So, Aruna, if I could ask you, so as you look across the market, how are sponsor companies approaching the shift from a fragmented to integrated supply models? And then what commercial or strategic benefits are they kind of realizing?
Yeah, I mean, as on a daily basis, we work with the sponsors, right? And we are seeing more and more consolidation on the vendor side. And we like to call ourselves as partners, right? Because if you take the vendor approach, it doesn't really work. You got to take that partnership, collaborator approach with, again, I'll use the word vendor, but that's the common word, how we define each of the points in this vein to vein, right? Making sure that you're consolidating each of these partners, collaborators, they have systems that are interconnected, so you have the visibility. And you are able to, we talked about integrated data platforms, right? That's very critical. We see as we hand off, people have to log into different systems, and doesn't really help, to determine the chain of custody, chain of compliance. It's broken, right? So as we go into that, we see that more and more companies or sponsors are coming and saying, let's look at the partners that can provide more integrated solutions. And this is not just going to help them operationally, but also, as we discussed, it's going to enable them to scale, go to the market faster, making sure that as they bring in more sites, as they bring in more regions, right, there is uniformity. There's not so much variations on how the drugs make it to the market or the therapies make it to the market. From a commercial and strategic benefits, I think, scalability is huge. Also, as you integrate and you remove the silos and the fragmentation, cost efficiency is huge, right? As we think of scaling, as we think of commercialization, cost is going to be huge for cell and gene. We still know that some of the cell and gene therapies are, huge price ticket, which makes it not accessible to many of the patients, which could be accessing those globally. So cost is huge, and that can be really achieved by integrating this different, I would say, in the vein-to-vein different, points in that. So, and plus you get the first market advantage, right? The better you're integrated you are, the faster you can, because the replication is easier. You don't have to figure it out again and again, right? So those would be kind of what I'm seeing, what the sponsors are moving towards.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks, Aruna. Let me get a little more specific here, Brian, and if I can ask you, so Carogen is developing novel payload delivery technologies. How do you see innovative platforms like cargo changing the way supply chains are designed and future-proofed?
Yeah, so I think we're trying to do a few things in that area. So one is simplification. We're trying to simplify the workflow across the board, and part of that is because we're an allo platform. We can simplify front-end logistics of not needing to get a new patient sample every time we want to manufacture a batch. We can also simplify the back-end logistics. So we would love to be able to ship 20 vials at a time to a site and have them be able to store things and not have to worry about ship on demand and worry about meeting patient timelines, things like that. So I think simplification of, the front and back end, just like we do the manufacturing side, right? On the manufacturing, we're trying to reduce the level of steps. We're trying to reduce the number of raw materials in the BOM. And I think that kind of simplification helps us get to where, we can reduce the number of handoffs, we can reduce the number of people involved, we can reduce the number of steps, because those steps are where you have risks. I think the other part of that is very similar to standardization. With a platform like ours, one thing we're trying to do is standardize on a platform where we can meet the needs of multiple different disease types. And by standardizing with a given platform, we also standardize a lot of the logistics around it. So they're all shipped at the same temperature, they're all shipped in the same way, they all have the same dynamics as far as thawing and things like that. So we can really reduce the differences from one product to the next, even from one disease to the next, where we have a very standardized platform and it's used the same kind of across the board. So, clinical sites get used to that and shippers get used to that. And we're not changing the game every time we come to a new product. So I think we have grown up as an industry with total lack of standardization, right? Every CAR T platform is even different, let alone every cell therapy. So I think what we've tried to do is say, if we can standardize across our platform to where everything ends up being the same kind of on the front and back end. And on the manufacturing side, sure, we have some changes we've got to do, but we try to make those even kind of modular. Then we can really simplify things and make sure that supply chains on both front and back end are simplified.
Gotcha. Perfect. Thanks, Brian. Maybe I can stick with you here. So let's look, where do you see regulators pushing the industry, or on integration or standardization, and how should companies be prepared for this? How can they prepare?
Yeah, so I think one is like chain of custody documentation. I think, starting 30 years ago when I was in this industry, that wasn't even a concept almost. Which is kind of a shame looking back. I mean, granted, fortunately, a lot of mistakes were not made, but the documentation of chain of custody wasn't what it is today. I think that's one thing we're really getting pushed on as an industry, and making sure that chain of custody, chain of identity is really strong. I think trying to get harmonization across CMC, again, we've grown up as an industry of doing everything ourselves, doing everything in a unique way. And part of that is differentiation. Part of that is doing something that we think makes a different product. But part of that is just because we haven't had standardized tools, we haven't had standardized platforms. So if you look at the general biologic space of making a monoclonal, very platformized, right? There's different tools, but they all work basically in the same way. And so I think we've got to start moving toward that. And I think that, you're seeing things like the ORI designation recently, where they got a designation from the FDA. And I think that's going to be a push we'll see from regulators more in the future, of trying to give designations to platforms to try to make them more widely used in the industry. And I think that will help the industry if we can get that. I think, the digitalness of, digitizing things, moving to digital traceability, again, chain of custody, things like that helps. And hopefully we'll see from the FDA and others more global harmonization on the regulatory side, which will help us, right? I think there's things that they can do of harmonizing their own records where we don't have to have something different for the EU than we do for the US, both in the way we design something, in the way we manufacture the facilities, things like that. So if we can get better harmonization there from them, I think it will really help the industry as well.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks, Brian. Dominic, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just kind of add on to, some of the thoughts of Brian, but, in my perspective and seeing the industry for a number of years, right, I think regulators have really taken an approach that's, look, we don't know everything, so they're always looking for input from those of us in the industry, right, and the developers and manufacturers. So they've been lenient on that for a while, but I think we're getting to a point now where the pressures are starting to change, and especially we're getting many more people that from a regulatory standpoint that understand the industry a lot better than they did in the past, and so they know what to look for. And I think one of the things that we've been seeing, and they're going to be pushing for as you are an early therapeutic developer, right, is are you identifying sooner than later aspects that introduce variability and the lack of control, right? So then that comes back to what can you standardize? And we understand that we're still an evolving field that requires a lot of innovation. So it's hard to standardize. So, but there are aspects, right? And we've touched on some of them already, and we'll touch on more, but even things as simple as cryopreservation, there's variability there. So how do we start to minimize the variability, which demonstrates more and more control? And I think that's where we're going to continue to see pressure, and that's where groups are going to be asked now earlier in their journey, right? As opposed to waiting until phase 2, phase 3, it's going to be looked at, no, we're not just going to get into the clinic and get through phase 1. We need to be able to see that you have thought about what this is going to look like. Is it going to scale, and can you, control the steps? And then that comes back to some of the other components of, digital and, traceability. And I think working, also identifying perhaps partners, all right, that can offer more than one component of that journey. And therefore, maybe that offers a bit more control as well, and enables you to scale.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thanks, Dom. John, anything you wanted to add here?
I don't think there's a whole lot to add after the two gentlemen spoke. There's quite a bit covered there. I guess the one thing that I could add is that as we think about moving forward, and this kind of resonates or I guess underlies what Dominic was saying, is our regulatory bodies, whether they be in Europe or in the US, they're learning more, and as they learn more, the bar is going to continue to get higher. And so we can't continue to do what we're doing today from an innovation perspective or an innovator company perspective and expect that what's working today will work tomorrow. And a big piece of that is holding yourself to a higher standard with regards to what the regulatory bodies are going to be asking for, and working with those same regulators to ensure that as they evolve, you're evolving with them. And if you're able to accomplish that as an innovator company, I think it's a big step towards preparing for the integration and standardization that we're talking about.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Yeah. So maybe, John, sticking with you, you've overseen manufacturing at global site levels. Are there lessons you've learned about building supply chains that can scale globally that you could share with us?
Yeah, I mean, sure. It's a heavy lift,
sure
or else we wouldn't have a webinar on it, right? But I think to scale globally, you really need standardized frameworks, which is a theme to this point in the webinar. Local adaptability, that being the ability to adapt locally to what's going on at other sites, And then, of course, redundancy built into that logistics network to ensure that if something goes wrong in one, you're not in a place where you're unable to move your product manufacturing forward. And so it really is about having a standardized global framework. So building out that framework and then having localized execution within that. And, you know, that requires adaptability within your network. And I think it's, you know, it goes back to the answer to the previous question, thinking about the regulatory bodies. Obviously, the EU has a different governing regulatory body than the US. And so you've got to have, on a global scale, regulatory experts within your organization that recognize the differences and are able to navigate those complexities in real time, such that, you know, your global unit or your global supply chain is not running into hurdles or unforeseen hurdles because they didn't anticipate, you know, bottlenecks or regulatory questions that would come up as a result of moving from the EU to the US or vice versa. And, you know, a big piece of that is really training and making sure that your sites are aligned globally on consistent standards that are global in nature and not necessarily geographic specific. And so, I mean, I think that that's, you know, the big thing is really understanding globally what's happening and then bringing that all together within your standardized framework locally.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks, John. I know that was a big question, and thanks for scaling it down for us. I'm sure there's been a lot of lessons learned. Dominic, if I could ask, so, you know, cryopreservation is often where variability creeps in. You mentioned that before. From your technical lens, what are the most common pitfalls in fragmented processes, and how do integrated approaches help to address these issues that come up?
You know, cryopreservation is a great topic for me, and I love, passionate about that. And I don't know if we necessarily have the time today to really truly uncover and unpack that challenge, but I'll do my best here to kind of give you a synopsis, right? So, you know, I think when you stated it, and we talked about the variability, and it was talked about in the beginning, the variability starts with the patients, right, and the starting material. And then subsequently, that variability impacts the downstream processes. So one of the things we've already talked about is how do we, you know, we're looking to minimize that, and regulators are going to be looking to do some of that as well, right? And looking at your processes and, you know, standardization. So, you know, if we dumb it down, right, and simplify this, when you first start out in your early clinical trials, you're probably potentially dealing with a small number of patients and maybe 1-2 clinical sites, right? So you rely on, as we have, right, fresh material, because it's easy to manage that, easy to control that. And then as you scale up to, or scale out to many clinical sites, and, you know, whether it's just in the US or now you've got regional and then global, it's oftentimes something you don't think about early on, right? And so now, one, you've got fresh material that's challenged because of the time frame and the criticality of getting that through the process and minimizing the impact on the cells themselves, right, and the quality. So you introduce cryopreservation, but same challenge now. Even if you introduce cryopreservation, that provides a significant benefit in your ability to manage that material, right? But if you're, again, thinking about a single site, easy, you can rely on the clinical site, perhaps, that offers cryopreservation, so they use their process. You might have your own process, and they use that process. Challenges come with that too. You've got to train the team, the site, and then you know, but again, regardless, as you start to scale that out, if you're relying on the clinical sites to run that process or your process, you often see that, right? So now everybody's got a different process, slight variation to it. And now you've put in something that should be adding control and standardization, but it's completely not standardized. So I think therein lies, one of the big reasons why we at Cryoport introduced IntegraCell and our cryopreservation services was really to focus on that major challenge. And that's really twofold, right? Adding in a level of standardization. So not just, again, not a centralized approach where, kind of distributed, decentralized approach where you can offer and utilize the same cryopreservation process globally, in a sense, right? So now you've built in that standardization, you've increased, simplified, for one, the quality components that surround that. And on top of that, as we talk about what do we need to do as we scale, right? One of the big things is automation. And so not only do we standardize, but we developed an automated solution for cryopreservation of that starting material. So now you've got standardized process that's scalable and deployable, and it so reduces your variability. It really drives reliability and consistency, and it enables the efficiencies at scale collectively. So all of those things, really are critical as we move forward in the industry. And I think that's sometimes something that is lost, or it's assumed, right? Everybody, cryopreservation is easy. We'll get to it when we need to, but it doesn't happen that way.
Exactly. Yeah. Dominic, thanks so much. That's great. So maybe let's turn now to look ahead. Let's see what's possible, what could be coming. And actually, I have a very similar question from one of our audience members, Jayanthi, who is asking kind of what I'm saying here. So if you're looking ahead, 3 to 5 years, what does a future-proofed supply chain look like for cell and gene therapies? And if you have any information you can provide, is there any guidance currently being developed that anyone's aware of? And Brian, if I could start with you on this, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm not aware of guidance. There may be, but I'm just not keeping track of it like I should maybe. But I think we all could do with better planning, better upfront stuff, and the more we do there, the more we can kind of future-proof supply chains for ourselves. I think I would love to see more digital platforms and more integration of platforms in the future, because I think that will help again. Because we talked about siloed information and lack of visibility, lens of transparency. And I think the more we integrate things, the better off we are for being able to catch things in advance and being able to kind of future-proof, the systems that we're creating if they're more integrated. I would love to see that we start involving more players in some ways. I mean, I think, future-proofing is also about reducing the number of players, but I think one thing we fail to do is oftentimes keep the end user in the loop here. And I think physicians and hospitals kind of get, we're just going to deliver to them and then they handle it, but they're not really part of the whole process. And I think the process needs to include all the way to the patient. So I think we're starting to see some people work on that kind of the last mile and making sure that that's an integrated piece. So it's not, the visibility and transparency doesn't end when it hits the hospital door. It doesn't end until it gets to the patient. So I think we need to be including that and making sure that as we plan ahead, we're planning all the way truly from vein to vein. And because I think so often we go vein to the loading dock at the end of my manufacturing run. So I think if we include that and make a little bit more comprehensive look, then it helps in making sure that we don't stumble at the last minute there.
Yeah, that's great stuff. Thanks, Brian. Aruna, how about if I can ask you the same thing? What are you seeing? What does a future-proof supply chain look like, and looking 3 to 5 years ahead for cell and gene?
Yeah, absolutely, Miles. And I think Brian brought up a very good point, the last mile, right? We often forget about the end of the mile, right? So as the physicians, the clinical sites, and everyone who are infusing this to the patients, and think about it, right? As of today, all these therapies follow a different route, a different process. And it's very tough for, say, there is a hospital or something, and they're dealing with 4 or 5 commercial therapies as of today, and they need to infuse it to the patients. They all have a different protocol. So there's not enough training, not enough education. So absolutely, I agree with him that including them as part of the process is very, very critical. Now, going back to standardization is going to be so critical as we move forward, right? And we'll see more as we all are getting educated, as we all are getting educated on the CGT, as the CGT is evolving from where it was. Standardization is going to become key, right, across all the critical processes, from all the way from collection to cryopreservation to logistic. And this is going to help us reduce the variability tremendously. Something I see and will be wonderful to see moving forward is fully integrated platforms, right? All the way from collection to patient delivery, every step of vein to vein, and visibility, so that we know from which patient it was collected, and making sure that it is fused to the same patient without any risk associated with it. I think one of the things that many of the sponsors, I would say, need to do is really sit down within their different functions within the company, right? We've seen very often that the cryopreservation team, the supply chain, the procurement, they all are not very interconnected. So how do you make sure, as you're doing the clinical phases, you're going through that, you are interconnected, you're designing that supply chain, right? And then once you've designed it and you've gone through it, and clinical, phase 1, 2 gives you that opportunity to evolve, right? To kind of make it better. And so when you go commercial, you're not trying to reinvent the wheel, right? You've done it and you have proved it, so you can be faster kind of getting your products to the market, because that's what everyone wants. I don't think fragmentation is sustainable, right? Integration is the way to scale, and it's very critical that we do that. I think, and also we need to get out of the more of the reactive kind of a way we behave as of today in cell therapy, when we talk about vein to vein, like, hey, let's put out the fires, versus saying, hey, let's kind of work through the planning process upfront, right? So we can remove all those risks associated with it. One thing we have seen, earlier when CGT was new, many years back, it was all about the science. It was all about the innovation. It seemed very cool, which still is, right? But now, as you want more investments into cell and gene therapy, as you're looking to commercialize, right? Investors are asking the question, give me a plan. What's your commercialization plan? And if you don't have that, you're not getting the investments you need, right? It's not about, science is very critical, but it's not about just the science anymore. And science was getting funded before. Now it's the commercialization that's added on top of that. And how do you do that, right? You do that by making sure that your supply chain is fully vetted, fully kind of, you've mapped it out. We have integrated platforms. We have talked about regulatory bodies. We have talked about standardization. And I see more and more of that happening in the next few years.
Perfect. Yeah, Aruna, that makes a ton of sense. Let's see. So maybe I could turn to some advice for some of our audience. So, let's look at how should emerging companies, those maybe preparing for their very first clinical shipment, be thinking differently about supply chain integration than a large biopharma approaching commercialization? And John, maybe we can kick off with you here.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and one that I see a lot in the world that I live in, being the business unit head for CDMO, where a lot of smaller emerging companies are coming to us for guidance. We're all chasing, the innovator companies are all chasing that next value inflection point, and typically that comes with clinical data. So that becomes the eyes are on that prize. But ultimately, if you're not thinking about integration from the very first day that you start thinking about clinical development, you run a massive risk in terms of your supply chain and your longer term success. Big pharma can get away with this because big pharma have deep pockets, expansive networks, and they can basically spend past the lack of, foresight in terms of where they stand with regards to their supply chain systems. So emerging companies really need to build integration from their strategy from the very, very start. And even though they're still at very small scale. And how do they do this? Partnerships with CDMOs, of course. In today's geopolitical market, we're not seeing the capital that's available to build your own facilities in many cases. And so thinking about, even if you do have your own manufacturing, thinking about partnering with CDMOs to go beyond your early stage clinical trials and into commercialization, it makes sense to have those relationships built before you need them rather than at the last minute, which I can tell you all too often is what I see with folks that we have conversations around. And then another big piece of this, and I think it's a recurring theme throughout the webinar thus far, is digital solutions, making sure that those investments are made early, that really enable the scale in terms of moving from early clinical to pivotal and then into commercialization. Because invariably what happens if you don't make those investments early, ultimately what ends up happening is you have to fix them before going commercial, and that slows you down, and it becomes very, very costly to retrofit rather than to build with a vision and a strategy in place from the very first, the genesis of that need.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks, John. Along those lines, Dominic, any thoughts on that question? How emerging companies should be thinking differently about supply chain integration than large biopharmas approaching commercialization?
Yeah, I think it was John obviously covered a lot of topics there, and even before that with Aruna and some of her comments really were spot on. But I think generally speaking, we think about the supply chain integration obviously isn't a one size fits all problem, right? So there are distinct needs and differences, and what's going to work for a global biopharma delivering that commercial CAR T, for example, isn't really going to work for a startup preparing for their first clinical trial. And we see this on a regular basis, obviously within Cryoport as we work with a lot of these groups, both early stage and late phase. And you think about an emerging CGT company, entering clinical trials. The first few shipments, they're not just logistics, right? This is part of your clinical data package, and so any errors that can happen there can lead to trial delays and trigger audits, impact patients' rights. But then you think about companies approaching commercialization. It's more about volume centric and looking really to balance costs and efficiencies. And so, the bottom line there is companies entering a clinic, they really, oftentimes you need a really hands-on approach, right? Because you don't have the foundation built, you don't have the standardization. So you need something that's resilient, compliant, and really flexible from a supply chain standpoint. And then that really has the groundwork, to build from that start to evolve. And then, of course, the large biopharmas, they've got that framework already built, and so now it's really optimizing and driving efficiencies to meet the global demand. So I think they're both obviously unique, but then they, as discussed earlier, having the right partners is really a critical piece of that to ensure that you've got the right support and relying on it. Much like John said, whether it's the CDMOs or the logistics providers, that's where the expertise is. We've been through this.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks, Dominic. So we're approaching the top of the hour here. And so audience members, if you have any questions for our panel, please ask them now. We've got several that have come in. I'm going to get the kind of one more thing here before we kind of get to some live Q&A as well. But please make sure to get your questions in now. It's a great time. So for the panel, we'll get one more thing. For all the organizations listening today, what is one actionable step that they can take right now to begin defragmenting their supply chain and really just setting themselves up for success? And Brian, would you kick us off here?
Sure. Yeah. So I would say, the first thing to do is just it's all planning, right? So map out your supply chain from vein to vein. Really make sure you know exactly what your handoffs are, because your handoffs are your risks. And then see if there's anything you can do to consolidate, right? If the way you have it planned out is you've got 4 people on the front end and 4 people on the back end, and you have all these changes from place to place, is there any way you can consolidate that? Is there any way you can kind of merge 2 into 1? Can you work with suppliers that maybe can give you some advantages of being able to do more than one thing? So I would say simplify where you can and consolidate that supply chain as much as you can, and you de-risk a lot.
Perfect. John, any thoughts here?
Yeah, I think building on what Brian said, simplification is key here, and we're talking about a massive set of hurdles from which to deal. And so, if I'm sitting in an early innovator company thinking about what I have to tackle here, it's the old expression of eating an elephant, right? You're not going to sit down and eat that elephant all in one day. You've got to do it one bite at a time. And the way that looks, at least in my eyes, is looking at your entire supply chain and doing an audit and identifying what are the biggest risks that are going to hold my company back with regards to our product developments, GMP manufacturing, regulatory hurdles, et cetera. Doing that supply chain audit will give you one or two areas really to think about addressing those first. And so just pick one or two areas to standardize, whether it's cryopreservation or tracking of your logistics, et cetera, and then work on those things one at a time. Build your integration incrementally rather than trying to do it all at once. And building that momentum, I think, becomes paramount to really tackling this thing over time.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks, John. Dom, any insights?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about a lot of things here. I think my one statement really is, much like companies build and create advisory boards, right? I think with all the aspects we've talked about here today, and defragmenting and building standardization, I think you take the idea of this advisory network. They're there to really guide you. And so I think for cell therapies, one of the things we can do is, put together a trusted partner network, right? So having partners that have been there and done it, rely on them, work with them to really not just understand what you need to do, but then you've got that, hopefully you're starting to really simplify the process too, by simplifying your network and really limiting to those that perhaps have more than a single solution. Obviously you can't just, sometimes get away from that, but I think it's an opportunity to reduce variability, increase standardization, and increase consistency.
All right. Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks, Dom. And Aruna, maybe you have the last word on this, an actionable step, that our listeners today can take away.
No, I think my panelists have covered it very well here, but I would say one of the things that I see mostly, supply chain is an afterthought, right? As I've said before, the science, getting the therapy right is bigger focus for our developers versus looking at the supply chain. So I would say, do not ignore that, make sure it's equally important, because if you look at the traditional pharma versus how CGT works, supply chain is key to your success, right? Because the starting material in most of the cases is the patient material, and it goes back to the patient. So making sure that you've really mapped this out. And I would say, I think someone mentioned here that really working with your partners, relying on their experience, right, versus you trying to do it all, people who have already done it, who have the experience of working, they can also work with you in a consultative way, right? And provide you where you have seen that others have done the mistakes and how we have rectified those. So use this, information to your advantage. And I would say within the drug developer companies, I would say, get your clinical, manufacturing, logistic leaders all on the same table, right? As you work with the partners who are outside your company, making sure internally you are aligned is also very critical. So I would leave that with that thought.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks, Aruna. All right, so with that, I think let's get to some audience questions here. Audience members, please submit your questions. Just had a bunch come in right now. We're going to get to as many as we can here. Got about 10 minutes left. And then again, any that we don't get to, I'll pass along to our panel for some potential follow-up after the event. And so, Aruna, you're still big on the screen here, so let me stick with you. Someone was asking, and this is from David. So they said, you mentioned that you specialize in CGT. Are there standards that you adhere to that are CGT specific outside of GMP norms?
Yeah, I mean, look, GMP is considered at the gold standard, right? And the GMP definition varies in the vein to vein, what it means to each one of us, and what it there's just so much of confusion around it. But it's all about the good practices, right? And making sure that you follow that. So here at Cryoport, for example, right, we make sure there's chain of compliance, there's change of custody with every shipper that ships out, right? We make sure that we have our proprietary, very clean process, which means that every shipper, after every journey is there is a process we follow, making sure it's clean. Now, is that considered like a GMP? But this is something we exactly do, right? Making sure that we as a company, as a logistics provider, we do not introduce any kind of contamination or anything at our end. Like similarly for our cryopreservation facility that Dominic can talk more about it, we are making sure that all the good practices are implemented, be the bioservices offering. So I think from our standpoint, making sure that every piece of the vein to vein or the logistics that we touch across, making sure the good practices are followed and our standards are very high. And we make sure that within our company, our different locations, right, across the globe, we follow the same procedure. We have the same quality standards. So we as a company are absolutely not introducing any variability for our clients.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Aruna. That's perfect. Well, let's see. So, Dominic, Aruna mentioned you, and so I think I've got one here that is probably great for you. This was kind of asked when you were talking. So, coming in from Tanya, the biggest risk point in our process is the apheresis shipping. Since there's not a lot of room for anything to go wrong without compromising the viability of the cells, is there something you can recommend for contingency planning here?
Yeah, I mean, the first thought is obviously if you can, and then you should really consider early on cryopreservation of that source material, right? I mean, it's not to be obvious, but I think that's one of the aspects that we see on a regular basis in the industry is, it's not oftentimes considered, you think fresh is really best. And true, that is, right? The fresh material, if you can work with that, it is going to be the best option. But we know that there's so many limitations and challenges. So implementing a cryopreservation step early on provides you with that flexibility, right? So if you can, do fresh, great. But you also have cryopreservation as an option. And then at some point you may simply find, as studies have been demonstrating for certain products, that cryopreservation of the starting material is just as efficient and acceptable as a fresh material. But if I take that cryo lens out, right, I would also say that you really focus on, again, working with your supplier, your logistics provider to make sure that you have evaluated all your shipping lanes, et cetera, and working with validated shippers, and you're monitoring everything that you can. But again, it's I think John or Brian mentioned just thinking and planning ahead is really one of your biggest components, and that's thinking about the process, and then whether that includes adding cryopreservation in. Don't wait till later. Put those in place early.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dominic. Let's see. We can get through a couple more here. And so this one coming in, so they're asking, how can the industry kind of as a whole help accelerate this integration and standardization? And maybe Brian, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I would love to see some of the organizations around like IOCT and ARM and NIST and groups like that come in and do some things, right? I think, where in the past groups like that, like NIST has done something around cell counting and trying to get some standardization, right? And a lot of people start following that. And I think when you get people following it, it creates pressure for others to do so. And we actually end up with some industry standardization. So I think some of these groups, in fact, has been another one that's done a lot of the manufacturing side. So I think groups like that coming in would help quite a bit, because if they can come in and really look at this globally, look at this across all the different manufacturing and supply chain scenarios, they can start setting up realistic and logical guidances. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a a standardization that goes into an FDA reg, but if we can provide some standardization through these volunteer organizations, I think that would be a good first step.
Yeah, that's perfect, Brian. Thanks. Let's see. So let me see, John, I want to get you back in here. Let's see if we can find one for you. And so, yeah, so as more sponsors look to de-risk clinical and commercial scale manufacturing, this is perfect. How can CDMOs position themselves as integrators, not just service providers in the advanced therapy supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, as you think about a CDMO, more traditionally, these are just transactional services where you come to your CDMO, they provide you with manufacturing, maybe some fill finish at the back end of that for drug product, fee for service, and then move about. But today's CDMO is much more complex and sophisticated than they were 10 to 15 years ago. And as you think about de-risking clinical and commercial scale manufacturing, looking for CDMOs that have more than just that transactional setup, I think is very, very important. Thinking about end-to-end connectivity and exploiting the knowledge, the internal knowledge that these CDMOs like SK pharmteco have, whether it be through providing connectivity across collection sites, obviously manufacturing. We talked about global manufacturing earlier and the things that come with that in terms of having a CDMO that has that capability. Logistics obviously are implicit therein, and then of course regulatory readiness. Interfacing with the CDMO that has a pipeline of programs that are currently in the clinic and or commercially available. There's a lot of regulatory knowledge that comes with that as just part of walking that road. And so working with the CDMO, you can get exposure and potentially even integrate into their own infrastructure. Think about digital visibility with existing infrastructure inside a CDMO around logistics, for example, is something that we've talked about quite a bit on this discussion today. Most CDMOs have something that you can tap right into. And so CDMOs really can be the glue of that supply chain, and not just making product, but connecting the dots to ensure the scale, the quality, and the reliability that innovator companies need across that entire value chain.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks, John.
Maybe I could just add one thing
That'd
there.
be perfect, Brian.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I do think what John said is perfect, and it he talked about kind of the new form of CDMO, but I think it's not just time. I think it's people specializing specifically in CGT, right? And I think part of that is the realization that CDMOs have to provide broader services in some ways. So you see CDMOs kind of having their own biorepository, CDMOs really getting involved in the logistics side of things, and specializing in those things. Because in a traditional biologic, they make drug substance, they ship it off, right? Or they may make drug product, they ship it off. But they're not really involved in all those down the road things. And I think a lot of the CDMOs we have today really take it upon themselves to help with front end logistics, to help with back end logistics, and really scale their operations deeper in both ends of those. And I think it's a benefit to the industry in general, right? To work with CDMOs that have those kind of really comprehensive offerings.
Perfect. Thanks, Brian. And maybe we could just get one more last one in here. We're almost right at the top of the hour. And this is a great place to wrap up because it all comes down to the patient's experience. So Brian, how does the patient experience factor into supply chain integration?
Trying to get off mute there.
All good.
It's interesting because patients don't really see a lot of this, right? They're everything is kind of behind a black box, and they don't really see that. But I do think that the patients really benefit from us doing this well because especially with autologous therapies, because patients really at the back end of this, if a dose is missed, they don't have any alternatives, right? If something gets messed up or if something's delayed, if there's something that has to be rescheduled, it really messes with the patient. They're the ones that really suffer. So I think from my expectation. It's having the patient in mind through all this, through all we're doing. The logistics, the manufacturing, everything. It's all about the patient in the end, and you really have to be working toward making sure that everything works as well, not just to get the product that they need, but to get to them on time. I mean, think about patients that are, how difficult sometimes it is for them to get to the hospital and get an infusion. And what if they get there and all of a sudden they find out the product's not there and they've got to go home and come back the next day? So I think it's when you put it in those kind of practical context, the patient viewpoint, I think, is extremely important. And we just got to make sure that we're keeping it in mind.
Brian, that's perfect. Thanks so much. And that's a great place, I think, for us to wrap up here. With that, again, we have some questions left we didn't get to. So audience members, don't worry, I'm going to pass those along, and you can also still submit some right now if you want to. If you've got anything you could think of, get those submitted. But with that, I just wanted to thank our panel again, Brian Newsom, John Lee, Dominic Clark, and Aruna Moore. A wonderful discussion. Appreciate you all being here today. And then audience members, we thank you so much as well. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for being here with us. We hope that you all have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.